Today we're going to walk you through the install of your Polaris Racer XP4, XP4T, and Turbo S tank. We're going to start with disassembly of the dash, passenger side panels, and skid plates, and then move on to installing the harness, tanks, and plumbing. Now if this is the first time you're installing this kit, clear an afternoon, that way you don't have to rush through each one of the steps. And refer to the orientation guide to familiarize yourself with the products and the tools needed. Here you'll also find the templates required to do the install, as well as detailed instructions with notes and tips to help you along the way. Let's get started. First thing to do is remove this front cover. Let's do that by turning these locks 90 degrees, lift up at the rear, and then slide the cover forward and out of your way. With the cover off, now we can remove the 4 T40 Torques that are holding the upper dash in place. Now for the guys with stock cages, this next portion is going to be pretty easy. As you can see, this car has an aftermarket cage, so we're going to have to take our time getting the dash out past these bars. One of the things that you might do to kind of help that out is there's 2 plastic rivets here. We're going to pull those out to take the center cover over the command out, and then wiggle this guy back. With this aftermarket cage sitting so low to the dash, we had to pull some shenanigans to get the upper dash out. But for all you guys with factory cages, that's not an issue. Once you get those 4 bolts out, this thing's gonna pop straight up, giving you access to the inside where you're gonna feed the harness through later. So now that that is out, we're gonna move on to removing the fenders as well as the side skirt. With the front fender, side skirt, and rear fender, we're gonna be using the same T40 Torques and a panel popper or a flathead screwdriver. And just like every step in along the way, either take a picture of where all the hardware is or set it aside, lay it out in the way that it came off the car. That way you don't have to remember, and you can be sure everything goes back on where it belongs. That out of the way. Behind the fender here, there is 1 more Torx that you're going to need to get. As well as a plastic rivet on the inside of the kick panel. Here's the plastic rivet that needs to come out from the kick panel. Freeing up the bodywork so that we're able to get the passenger side rocker panel out. So now we'll just continue down along the rocker panel. Working our way through the front seat. Now this car has been heavily modified, so the B-pillar portion of the assembly is gone on this car. There will be a T20 Torx that we need to unscrew here, as well as another plastic rivet. Here's a cut-in to kind of show you what that part of the disassembly looks like. Okay, and on to the back. Again, in the stock configuration, there will be a plastic rivet on the back side of the B-pillar, as well as 2 more T40 Torx that hold the latch for the rear door in place. With those out, we're just going to continue down, pulling the rest of the hardware out. Before we move to the rear fender, we want to get the gas cap off as well. Now unscrewing it's simple enough, but you'll notice there's a tether attached to it. That tether has a lock on the bottom. If you take a pair of needle nose pliers, you can actually reach in, grab that lock, and give it a slight twist, and that'll be just enough to release this and allow it to pass through the filler neck. At the rear fender, it's just more of the same. T40 Torx and a panel popper will allow you to get everything off. From inside the fender, there's a few plastic rivets that we need to get out. Fender will come out. With that fender lip off, you're able to access the rest of the rivets that need to come out from the backside. One here, and there's actually two inside here. With all the rivets and the hardware out, you should be able to just pull out on the body panel and set that aside. The last thing we'll need to remove is a plastic rivet that is on the back side of the rocker panel right next to the tunnel for the fuel filler. I have seen models that have had two back here. On this particular one, it's just one, so we'll pop that out. Now, with factory seats, if you're having an issue there, you can always just pull the seat out and give you a little more space to remove that. With that out, now the rocker can be lifted up over the filler neck, removed and set aside. With the rocker panel off, now we can make the modification to the relief where the fuel filler is to allow the hoses from the EXR tank to meet up with the adapter. To do that, you're going to grab the template out of your instructions. We're going to cut this guy out. Quick side note before we continue, don't throw this away. We're going to need this other template here in just a few minutes. Okay, with that cut out, you'll notice that it fits in the front edge of the relief here following the body line. Once in place, just grab a couple little pieces of tape to hold it. So that we're able to mark inside this oval accurately. Hold that guy down again. Make your line around it a few times. That way when you know you pull off the template, it's going to be easy to see. And now we have the area that we need to cut out. With whatever cutting device you'd like, we're going to use a drill bit and then go on to a carbide. We're going to want to remove everything inside this oval, including the line itself. With a round file or a deburring tool, you can get all of this extra pieces off the outside edge. As well as the inside edge. Okay. Rocker panel is ready to be cleaned up and put back in after the install. We'll also need to trim the back face of the passenger rear door sill to allow for the pressure hose to pass through this area. So we're looking at trimming this area here. The next modification we're going to make is just in front of the passenger front seat, and it's going to be creating the hole for the fuel filler for the EXR tank. Again, we have our trusty template, and I didn't mention this before, but you'll notice there's also instructions with each one of these as well as references. So if there's any concern about how to do this, it's on your template. So we'll cut this guy out. Okay, with it cut out, you notice dotted lines across the face of it. that is going to go right onto the radius, or where your floor pan just in front of the passenger seat goes from horizontal to vertical. So we got this guy cut out, show you how to put it in place and make the marks. Okay, template is placed here, the outside edge up against the door sill and the back edge in line with the frame itself. You can see that radius line we talked about sitting right on the radius of the floorboard. All that is good, so we are going to tape this in place. Grab our Sharpie or marking device and again trace the line. With the line made, we can remove our template. And just like we cut through the rocker panel, we'll do the same here. With that out, we'll go into the car, get the skid pans off, do a quick cleanup. We've lifted the car up so you can kind of see what we're doing, but this can be done just as easily on the ground. So you'll need 10mm, and we're going to be removing all the hardware for this first narrow skid, as well as the skid plate over the back seats. Now, if you're doing this on the ground, it isn't a bad idea to wear safety glasses because this stuff's going to be directly over you. And there's a good chance this is the first time these have come off, so there's liable to be a whole bunch of dirt in there. You don't want that in your eyes. So, safety glass is good. With all the disassembly done, take a quick inventory, make sure you got all the hardware off, set aside in an area and in a way that you know you'll be able to get it all back on. Now we'll do a quick cleanup. That way when we get into the install, we don't have all this dirt and trimmings from the modifications on our back. To begin the install, we want to pick a location in the upper center console for the EXR fuel tank switch. In this case, it's kind of been made for us. We're going to pop this cover out. Now we're going to come around to the front of the car and feed the harness through the grommet towards this opening. Okay, up here at the front firewall, you notice there's actually two grommets here. It does not matter which one the EXR fuel tank harness goes through, whichever's easiest. If you have an issue getting through either, or you find yourself not able to, you can also pierce a small hole in the larger grommet that you can then pass the harness through. One note though, if you're going to do that, make sure that you stay away from the factory harness. We don't want to damage that because it could cause all kinds of issues. So we're going to take the 3 pins that connect to the back side of the switch, go ahead and feed them through. Then we are going to get up above the dash. From the top side, you're going to take that harness and route it to the opening in the upper center console that you just made by removing that trim cover. Important point here is you want to make sure that it's routed such that it's not on any sharp edges or going around any sharp corners that could create chafing, wear the wires, and either create an open or a short later on. So now that's fed back out, we can install the switch and connect power to the distribution box. connect the switch, you want the black wire to the very top pin. You're going to connect the power from the fuse to the middle pin. Now, if you don't know which one that is, you can hold onto the wires and actually pull on the fuse and get that to move, letting you know which pin is which. So, red wire from the fuse in the middle, and the lead that goes all the way out to the pumps on the bottom. With those installed, push the switch back into the upper console until you hear the locks click. Now we're going to connect power and ground to the distribution block. Here the black wire is going to go to ground, and the red is going to go to the accessory voltage or key on battery. Now you can find that either with a voltmeter or a test light. What you want to do is put your red lead on one of the terminals and get a good ground, and then you'll turn the key on. And if you show power at that terminal, you know that that is your accessory terminal. With the key off, you'll have no power. You can see here I have that. Come over here to ground, there is no power. I know for sure this is my accessory power terminal and this is my ground. So with that information, we can connect these. Here, depending on the vehicle, it's either going to be a 3/8 or a 10 millimeter. With the harness connected, now we want to route the lead for the pumps down the firewall and out towards the passenger wheel well. One note as you're doing this, try to kind of route this tight to the firewall in as straight and clean a line as possible. That way the whole area kind of stays sanitary. We're not making a big old spider web of stuff. So that's out the bottom. One quick side note, you'll notice the fuse is not in the holder. Do not put the fuse in until the entire system is connected and we're ready to test. That way we ensure that we're not getting power anywhere in the system and potentially creating any problems. Now from the passenger front wheel well, we're going to take that same harness and continue to route it down along the firewall and just over the top of the coolant lines here, following the factory harness that goes into the drive shaft tunnel and towards the rear of the car. Okay, now we'll go under the vehicle to finish the routing. Underneath, we'll just take the harness, put it in position, which will be kind of up above the coolant lines. And we can move on to the tank preparation. Now to prep for the driver's side tank install, first you'll notice these two coolant lines here. We're going to be installing the balance hose for the driver's side tank over the top of these. So we just want to take and modify this top line slightly just to give enough room for that hose to come through. With that done, we're going to switch to the passenger side. On the passenger side, we're trying to make room for that same balance hose. Here you'll notice the factory harness in the way. So we're either going to roll that down or when you install, if you find that's not moving down enough, there's actually a zip tie right here that you can cut to give you just a little bit more movement and allow that balance hose to pass through. Last step for preparation before we can actually install the tank is to get the 20 to 45 clamps out of the kit. Install those on the long straps. We're actually going to feed that through, install all of these straps, and tighten the hose clamps just enough that they stay in place. Now you notice with all these, we have the head of the clamp towards the top and facing to the rear of the car. That way we can access these for final tightening after the tanks are installed. For now, they're just loose enough that these things will hang, but aren't so tight that we can't move them. So now move on to the front clamps. One thing you'll notice, both front clamps in the center are identical, whereas the outside clamps are mirrors of each other. The reason for this is we're actually going right around the outside of this floor brace with the outside clamp. So that guy will install here and will actually register up against the edge of this floor brace. All straps are installed, we're ready to start with the driver's side tank. Before the driver's side tank goes in the car, take the 2-inch balance hose, slide that all the way on until it touches the face of the tank. Then put on the supplied 50 by 70 hose clamps with the heads facing up and what will be towards the front of the vehicle. You want to tighten these just enough that they're able to move around freely, but not so loose that they're kind of falling over the place. Okay, with those guys in place, now we can feed this up into the vehicle. To install, you want to feed from the balance hose first, kind of pass that through up into the cavity where it's going to live. As you're doing that, the breather hose is going to actually go above that. You want to kind of feed that through, make sure that it doesn't come into contact with any of the hardware that's protruding down into the channel. The goal here being that the breather hose is actually going to live behind all the hardware in the channel. So, breather hose through first. Balance hose up and in. And as you're doing this, you're kind of just watching those pieces and making sure they end up where we intend them. So now that we're getting closer, we can pay attention to the fuel pump lead. We're going to take that, pass that into the center of the vehicle, into the drive shaft tunnel. And continue to move this into place, kind of watching each one of the items, making sure they route as intended. Perfect. Now if you come around to the front, what you're hoping to get is the wiring harness protrudes out and is free from hitting the balance hose or the top of the tank. There's actually a small notch in the floor pan here that is the ideal location for that harness to exit. So, now that we know our harness is exiting in the correct spot, we'll come back over here, we'll make sure our breather hose is sitting up in the channel, not running into the hardware. And obviously our balance hose has made it over to the other side. We can lift these straps up, put a couple nuts on them and kind of just hold that in place. And it's important not to tighten that just yet. We don't want to do that until we get the whole tank installed. So, with the tank up, Tank in place, we'll install a couple nuts. Again, we're not tightening anything just yet. Just want to kind of have this up in place so we don't have to worry about it falling down. Two other quick tips before we put the passenger tank in. Take the breather line from the driver's side and route that all the way out to the edge. So it's clear of the tank. And then the second part is if you have some kind of dry lube, spray a little bit of dry lube on the inside of the 2-inch balance hose. And that's gonna make the passenger tank a lot easier to slide into that hose. Before we install the passenger tank, make sure to take the gas cap off. We'll uncoil the feed and vent lines. And then take this guy and put it in place. Just like the driver's tank, the passenger side tank is going to feed into the car from the center first, and that's because we want the balance tube to register on this nipple here. At the very least, what we're trying to do is get the top of the balance tube to register on the outside here. Then if we need to, we can either use a set of needle nose pliers or a coolant hose hook and kind of work the rest of it around the outside. So we'll start here. We're going to go in, feed the electrical over the top of the coolant hoses and the stock wiring harness kind of towards the front of the vehicle there in the tunnel. We'll take the transfer hose that's inside the 2-inch balance hose, feed it into the passenger tank. Now that we've done that, we're actually going to take the 5/16 feed line, and that's going to run through the front hole in this gusset. We're going to pull the slack out of that. We're going to take the 3/8 vent line, and that's going to run through the back hole in this side gusset. Pull the slack out of that. Just double check that our breather line from the driver's side tank is still where it's supposed to be. And we'll continue to work this up, pulling the slack out of these as we go. Take a quick look inside and make sure that our balance hose is registering on the tank. Yes, it is. Make sure we're good on the inside. We still are. We're also checking to make sure that the passenger harness is exiting just forward of the balance hose. There's a small gap between the top of the tank and the floorboard. We want to exit through that gap, that way we're not pinching this harness either. Everything looks good. Breather line is staying in place. Vent lines are where they should be. So we'll keep working this up and towards the center of the vehicle. Now with some cars, like we're seeing with this one, the coolant lines are actually a little bit further out towards the outside of the chassis than other cars. So one of the things we'll have to do is just really gently, and do this on the brackets, not actually on the lines themselves. We'll ever so gently move them as we continue to work this into place. Okay, with the straps in place, we'll rotate all the hose clamps so the heads are up on top. Good, 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 and good. Before we tighten up the straps, one quick note. We want the inside straps to be somewhere between like a 1/2 inch and 1 inch away from the inside edge of the tank. That way we're supporting the load. The outside straps, just make sure that the short front strap is registered all the way against that floor brace we talked about. That'll put the entire strap really close to the radius in these cross tubes on both sides. Everything looks good now, so we're going to tighten up all 4 of the top locks, then go through and tighten all of the hose clamps. Okay, with the tanks centered in their cavities and all the hardware tight, now we can go up to the balance hose, slide it towards the passenger side tank, and then tighten up the clamps on the driver and passenger side. Right now I'm locking the passenger side clamp into position. Every one of these cars is slightly different. You may find that you need to wiggle on the coolant hose or the harness a little bit more on one car versus another to kind of aid in getting that hose clamp in place, which it now is. Because on this particular car, the coolant lines are a little bit tighter to the tank than others. It's probably going to make life a little bit easier if we actually take a screwdriver, lightly pull out to move the coolant hoses towards the center of the car. Allow us to get our either screwdriver or nut driver in and tighten the clamp for this passenger side of the balance hose. Okay, now that we have the balance hose tight and we've confirmed, again, we are not pinching our wiring harnesses, we can go ahead and connect each one of those to the main harness. Once those are connected, feed them up above the coolant lines alongside the factory harness. Take the zip ties from the kit and go ahead and secure this new connected harness from here all the way up the firewall. That way we can ensure that it doesn't chafe against any sharp edges or come into contact with any hot surfaces. When you're putting the zip ties to secure the EXR harness to the factory harness, you'll find it's pretty tight in here. The key is just patience, taking your time, going over the drive shaft, under the drive shaft, kind of working however you can to get that installed. Once you have the zip tie together, if you can't pull it tight by hand, needle nose plier will be your friend by just grabbing the extra slack, kind of pulling that out of the zip tie, securing it in place. What I'm doing right now is actually positioning the back zip tie so that it's over the connectors of the harness. That way, we're holding it where the biggest load is. I'll also use the same needle nose pliers to secure all the other zip ties that we have positioned. Okay, we'll trim the extra off and that's now secure. One of the other things you can do if you're having trouble with this part of the install is you can actually remove the cup holders and the top of the center console. That's going to require a little extra work, but it will open this entire area up, so you can do that from the top. But with a little bit of patience, we're generally able to do the install from underneath, so you're not doing that extra work. With the tanks now installed, make sure to connect the driver's side breather hose to the passenger tank. And like with all the other fittings, if you have a little bit of dry lube, that always helps the situation. If you need, you can put your finger through the filler cap to the backside and hold the grommet in place. That way you ensure that it doesn't pop out. Just give that a quick feel on the backside and check on the front side, make sure the grommet is in place and nothing's moved. And that is ready to go. We can move on to the next step. Now we want to run the 5/16 pressure hose and 3/8 bend hose back towards the stock tank. Make sure to orientate the 3/8 hose on top. The goal here, once installed, is that we want to try not to have any low points in the 3/8 hose from where it connects to the stock tank through this gusset here. And the way we'll do this with the zip ties, if you have any questions about how to do a zip tie standoff, you can see our other video on that subject listed in the description below. We're not going to tighten those all the way just yet until we have everything run. So now the 5/16 will pass underneath the 3/8, up behind the chassis tube, and through the cutout that we made earlier. 3/8 hose you can kind of just rest out of the way. Now we're going to install the ball valve assembly, but first we'll pull the seat out to make that a little bit easier. Now in tightening this, you want to make sure that the head of the clamp is towards the outside and facing down. That way, if for whatever reason you have to take this off later, you won't have to remove the entire rocker panel. You'll just be able to take the bolts off the bottom, pry this up, and get to that hardware. Okay, with that in place, now we can size our 5/16 hose. If there's any extra material in your setup, just cut the end off. And again, dry lube is your friend. We'll dry lube that and slide that on. With that installed, we want to add another zip tie here. The reason for this one is we're going to use it to pull the hose towards the tube. That way we don't get a chafing against the plastic panel here. With that in place, now we can come back through, make sure that we have adequate space around each one of the hoses. That way it's not pulling hard on the edge of the hole it's passing through in the gusset. I'm going to put a zip tie on them here. That way they kind of hold each other in place. Then as I'm watching that, we're going to tighten all of our other Now just snug enough that it's going to hold everything in place. You don't want to tighten these so much that it's crushing the hose. Something like that will give us a pretty nice straight line from the OE tank to the EXR tank. With everything tight, a pair of flush cuts if you have them, so we don't have any sharp edges. Take all the extra off. Now we are ready to put the rocker panel back on and install the adapter. To reinstall the rocker panel, we'll start up front. We tilt the bodywork away just enough to get it up underneath here. And then work it back on. Get our hoses out of the way. And slide the filler through the rocker panel. Get our 5/16 and our 3/8 hoses and bring those through the opening. Now that the rocker panel is back in place, we're going to take the inner filler neck adapter and thread that onto the tank. One quick note here, do yourself a favor and just start each one of the set screws, making sure that it doesn't go so far that it's protruding beyond the bottom or the inside here. That way you don't have to do this once it's on. So we got those all installed. We'll take this, thread it onto the tank, snug it down there, and then with the supplied Allen wrench, we're going to tighten all 3 of these. That way this doesn't have the ability to work itself back out. Okay, all 3 of those are tight. Now we're going to do the same thing with the outer adapter. Install all 3 of the set screws till they're just flush with the inside. We're going to get our dry lube that's been saving our butt this far. Spray a little dry lube on each. Install on the outer adapter. And whether we're using a dry lube or some kind of O-ring grease, or even just a general purpose grease, we want to put a little bit of lubrication on this seal. That way, as we're sliding this onto it, there's no chance of the outer adapter cutting the O-ring on the inner adapter. This is a really tight fit, and that's why we want to do it, so we don't create an issue for ourselves down the road. Okay, that guy is in place. We're going to use the same supplied Allen key, and we're going to tighten all 3 of the set screws. One thing I should note, make sure to push the rocker panel in place and correct the orientation of the outer adapter so that the hoses don't actually touch the panel before you tighten. Okay, that is tight. We have clearance around all the hoses. Now that we've got that tight, before we install everything in the reverse order that we took it apart, we want to go back through, fill the tank full of gas, check for leaks, Do an operation test. Make sure that you're getting fuel pumping into the tank. None of that's leaking. Once you've done the leak test and the operation test, go back through it, double check that you've zip tied your harness out of the way so it's not going to chafe against anything. Make sure that all of the components have been tightened, and then we're ready to go back together in the reverse order. Now you can go further with the extra range.